am William F. Bryant, and this is my second episode for my Moped podcast. It's July 7th, I believe, if my watch didn't stop. It's a little bit muggy outside, and one of those hot summer days. It seems a little bit too early to be this hot, but I still like being outside, and it looks like we're going to have a little bit of a storm roll in. Hopefully, get this done and it's not too distracting, but here we go. I wanted to start to go into a little bit more on demand and what exactly that is and means. Talk about the supply chains, because I don't know if people really know what that is. And then, of course, the PMI index, because those numbers had come out over the weekend, and how what that actually is, because a lot of times people are just supposed to be told, hey, these are good numbers, and just go with it, but they don't really know what goes into the numbers or what it's composed of, and then go a little bit further into government's reaction, or what should be a lack thereof, and actually is a lack thereof, given all of the stuff that's going on, not just in the economy, but also in protests, riots, and so on, and how that's actually kind of playing in, because it all actually does tie together to a degree, or could down the line. And actually, I might just jump in with the government aspect. So what people have been seeing is the direct result of a lack of government intervention in things that are going on. Now, whether that's a lack of intervention because of the fact that they're afraid to do any kind of intervention, or whether that's because they have an ideological opinion on the events that are going on, or just flat out are Marxists to the core and would like to see the destruction of our freedoms. You can make your own choice. You're going to deal with the people in your area more directly, and hopefully before voting for them know something about them. Unfortunately, in our system of government, and just really in our voting populace, somewhere along the lines, people were convinced that it was bad to discuss politics, talk about politics, or even that it was a waste of time or against their best interest to vote or pay attention to these people. The get out the vote on the left was more or less because they knew that to push their ideology further and further left, they needed to get out the people to actually have the numbers to compete with the right, because they knew most people wouldn't sell out their country. However, if you can subvert people's natural inclination to be patriotic and show them things that aren't necessarily facts and brainwash them of sorts, you can get the desired change you want and get the people to vote on your side. Plenty of people have done different discussions on this stuff, and you can look up all sorts of things covering the history of Marxism, the ideology, how it all started, how for the longest time the Soviet Union decided to, and I shouldn't just say the Soviet Union, they went through their own uprising with Marxism as well. But using the 15 to 20 years in our education system to create the next wave of basically educators and leaders, and then another 10 to 15 years after that to create those who would follow and be subservient to those leaders. And so now you actually do see the couple of generations of what has happened, because those ideologies have been allowed to be pushed in education systems. And since they have been allowed to be pushed, you have two generations of brainwashed people. You now have what's necessary both in government infrastructure and also the judiciary, and then the followers on top of that. And then, of course, the movements going along with it, too, that have kind of been usurped and taken over for their own gains as well. And this hasn't just happened here. You can see plenty of times it has happened. Most recently, probably Venezuela and Chile are two of the more recent ones that have happened. You can look them up. You can read about them. Interestingly enough, what happened in Chile when they went and swung, they'll call it socialism, but communism. They voted for a communist president and then went extremely the other way and voted for a billionaire. I guess you'd say conservative. They don't really have those kinds of leanings. It's not really drawn up exactly the same way as ours are here, but they went the completely opposite way. And then, of course, right after him, they went back the other way, back to communism. The interesting thing, though, somewhere along the way there was a military coup to kind of set things straight because they were going too far left. And during that military coup, the Constitution was rewritten and structured by capital market believing economists. And so they actually wrote their economic belief or economic system into their constitution to make it really difficult to change. So you couldn't really go full on communism and to kind of create some sort of a free market zone. Much probably you could draw, kind of a kinship with that of China and Hong Kong. Of course, now Hong Kong's coming into issues there as well, and so you can see not that stuff doesn't last, and even things that are written down, the writing itself doesn't prevent it. At some point in time, somebody has to be there to uphold it, and that also goes for our Constitution. So our governments, local and state, definitely, you can see, have been usurped deeply. You see attorney generals not upholding the rule of law. You see town and city mayors and city councils disbanding police departments. You see governors not bothering to attempt to uphold the law or protect property rights, and everything kind of breaking down and going to hell. Well, people who voted for those people brought it upon themselves. I think part of the problem is that in American society, nobody ever wants to hear the bad things. Nobody ever wants to believe things can be bad. If they are, they just want to turn the conversation to something rosy. There's no way to really, same way you can't discuss an ideological change with somebody who's a devout Kool-Aid drinking progressive Marxist. You really can't talk to people who don't want to hear bad things and just want to believe everything's sunshine and rainbows. And that's unfortunate, because that there in itself is part of the reason why we ended up in the situation we're in, because those who have been blowing the whistle on these events and what was happening since 2008 were largely either unheard or demonized, and the conspiracy theorist title has been thrown about and gave them a very bad rap or reputation, tried to destroy their reputation, tried to destroy their ability to make a living, have a life, and all those things, partly because people just didn't want to hear the bad stuff, whether they knew it might have been true, and obviously largely because of the fact that if that ideology of patriotism caught on, and that there was a Marxist subversion, it would alert the country too early before they were able to prep and really destroy the country. I still maintain that the last election that we had put a huge pause on it, which is why we're seeing what we are right now. Unfortunately, we're also now seeing government inaction that is causing us to still rocket towards it, whether we know it or not. And a lot of that has to do with the financial aspects, because people seldom really understand that communism is just state-owned property. Nobody owns private property. And that all comes from the way things are financed in there. In fact, the biggest issue that the Soviet Union had with its demise was the fact that we were able to outspend them, just a more efficient economy. The more you study economics, the more you begin to understand that there's no way one central planner could have the necessary information to run as efficiently as the market. And that is, were it to be a free market. However, our system has slowly, and it hasn't really been begrudgingly because it's free money, but moved towards a socialist, and even now is approaching a base communist ownership of property. And I don't think even a lot of people understand that, and setting the stage for it right now. The first and foremost, though, I think, since nobody really seems to have any idea exactly what to do, I think people should have awoken to the fact that your local government is key to the beginning of any resistance. That started with sanctuary cities for your gun rights, if you saw that was coming up. And that was also the point of defiance for an awful lot of places, if you remember that, when they became sanctuary cities against the laws of the United States and immigration. But notice how they were never really punished for that. And so they were just allowed to continue. And that really should have been a wake-up call right there, when your government won't even uphold its own laws, that there's something deeper and much more sinister going on. However, if you live in the places that still believe in patriotism and pro-American beliefs, the Constitution, your Bill of Rights, and all those things, those mayors, governors, and to a great degree your sheriffs, I've always been much more aligned with the belief that sheriffs are the proper law upholders, given that they're still accountable to somebody. They've been voted in. They haven't gotten appointed, and appointments tend to have political leanings and don't necessarily align with the oaths that they have taken. And I don't know if you necessarily have seen that, but I'm sure people probably have, and that's an issue with the police departments. And so it's, what I find interesting is the fact that not too long ago, everybody was talking about how departments were violating rights the way it was. Illegal search and seizures, no-knock raids. Dude, I forget what they call it when they just are allowed to confiscate property, and that passed through. Make no qualms about it. Law enforcement is important, but law enforcement is important, not selective law enforcement, which is what we're seeing, and we're actually seeing that from the departments that we're supposed to be supporting as well. So is reform needed? Yeah, absolutely. Is it defunding? No, but you need law enforcement, but you definitely need to approach the way it's done. Unfortunately, we're so deep in this now that I don't know how much reform we're going to be able to attain, because the different pockets in the U.S. are fairly fractured in their beliefs and what their mayors and governors are doing to their populace. And you can see that right out in the open. People's ultimate reaction to that is just simply to move. However, interestingly enough, during the economic collapse portion that we're suffering right now, one has to really wonder how much of that has been pushed to put people in a situation where they cannot be mobile and they cannot leave where they're at. And to a vast degree, that's exactly what we're seeing, is that the desire to and actually being able to are two different things. You have to have people willing and able to purchase in order to buy a home, oftentimes in order to move. But if you want to just discuss things from a voting perspective and government perspective, you start small, because they're the ones who have kind of the last line on what is done or not done in your particular area. And I mean, that's really why the House of Representatives was created. It wasn't just supposed to have two houses. You know, the senators initially were appointed by governors, and they were to represent the state's interests because it was a federation of states that had much more right to their borders and what they were actually ruling within the states. Before the Fed government came along and started bribing them with money and further debts and so on. There's an awful lot that goes into the financing of decisions and the push with which financial situations actually force decisions to be made. And so I think that was also one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to go in. And I've said this before with finance and economics. Finance and economics, they're the rules with which we live by. You know, for better or worse, that's what they are. And it doesn't really matter whether you're in socialism, communism, capitalism, some kind of pseudo mix of all of them. Those are the rules, and history just presents the strategies played. And if you understand those rules, you start to look at history in an entirely different perspective and what choices were made, why. Oftentimes, historians will cite, I don't know, such and such bullshit, whatever. And when it all comes down to money, almost always, money, land, power. Those are how your decisions are made. That's probably 95% of the time. So we have that exact same thing going on right now in our governments. If you're unhappy with what your council is doing, you need to make your voice heard. If you're unhappy with what your mayor is doing, you need to make your voice heard. If you're unhappy with what anything in your county, I mean, you don't even have to keep going outside of that if you don't want. I mean, if you can get up to the county level and you really push for particular representation at town, city, county level for judges, law enforcement, and so on, that will at least be a start for wherever it is that you're at. You can work your way beyond that as it goes, because the more counties that are effectively changed back to American values and patriotism, then your state will follow suit. That's pretty much how it works. Most of the states, anyway, are beholden to the urban centers that have now become Marxist strongholds and really just the worst representations of, I suppose I shouldn't say worst representations, but just dangerous places for the most part. Definitely not the tourist attractions that they maybe once were. I think a perfect example of that is if you look at Giuliani's New York versus de Blasio's New York. Which one would you rather visit? I don't think there's a lot of debate on that one. And the funny thing is that even people who are extreme left would probably also rather visit that New York. I've always found that so peculiar. Another point I wanted to make on government, since I was kind of discussing some of the financial pushes from that, if you look at, and also particularly because voting season is coming up, but if you look at whoever's resume is running for a position that you're going to vote for, and on that resume you don't think that person could possibly really do anything else, you should not vote for that person. I mean, that should be obvious, and I mean, lo and behold, that might take research. You might have to actually Google and go to their page and read some stuff, but since they hold your tax dollars and some of your rights that you are now seeing with the events that are occurring in your hands, you might want to make sure that person is legitimately able to fulfill the job of representing you and your community's beliefs and your rights. If you find that person probably couldn't really do much else decently in life, and even if they could, they'd probably be bad at it, don't vote for those people. If you need to find somebody else to put on the ballot, then do so. If you need no one on the ballot, then don't. There's plenty of towns that vote for dogs, for God's sakes, for mayors. And guess what? Government runs fine. They always want to convince you that you need government. But what does government really do? Government strips you of your ability to be self-sufficient. And it intentionally does that. And it doesn't really matter who's in government for the most part. They look to take more power from you. It's government presents a problem, but they also present the solution, which is bigger and more government. And guess what? That takes more of your money, because that's how government runs. It takes your money. You pay for it. Of course, the less self-sufficient you can become, obviously, the more dependent you have to be on government anyway. I thought it was really interesting to read articles and court battles, especially over the past 10 years, where areas decided that they would make it illegal to grow gardens to grow food. And I believe the one that I'd read was in Florida. Well, if you can't grow food and you're not able to do certain things, well, obviously that takes more of your self-sufficiency away, even if it's a small plot or a small amount. That probably brings me on to homeowners associations as well, because they don't want somebody to have a purple house or something next to them. If there's any government over you that takes your rights, this is probably bad. Just because you want somebody else to fight your battles for you, it leaves you also fighting against those same battles where the tables to be turned on you, and they always are. As you can see, I'm not a fan of government at all. I'm small government and only the most basic essentials, and everything else government should ask for permission to do. One of the biggest reasons I think for that is they take your tax dollars, and for all intents, you're an investor in the corporate entity that your government has become, and it should be giving you some kind of a return on that investment. The funny thing is that you very rarely get to see where that money goes or what that return even amounts to. You know, they'll put signs of, oh, this building project, this bridge, this road is a government project. Okay, that's great. I want to see your books. I want to see where this money is going to. I want to see what you're spending it on. I want to see your damn salaries is what I want to see. Because you look at your people who are around you, who you voted for, and they're driving, $70,000 SUVs. They've got private security. They live in big houses. You paid for all of that. Once again, I said, if they didn't have some kind of a business prior to going into government to try to run, if they have a resume or a previous resume that shows nothing that they have actually done or accomplished, then they are only living off your dole. It doesn't matter what they're promising to you. They're living off your dole. And no matter what, if you think that you don't pay taxes because you collect a check from the government, well, you do still pay taxes. All the city taxes come from things that they tax on sales of items or on licenses for businesses or other things of those natures. And those things are less likely to be in areas where you have to pay higher taxes, where people will get higher checks for things like welfare and social benefits and so on. Not to mention, those things also make you more reliant on government. And of course, more reliance on government means bigger government means takes more money. It's a cyclical action. That's how it works. And it's really something that should be thought of. And so now I'm going to stem off of the government aspect and see how they're squeezing the life out of the economy right now. Because as this goes on, if you're still drinking the Kool-Aid and you're still looking at this disease like this virus, that it's the bubonic plague of our century, it's simply not. It has been shown time and again that it isn't. The rates of the fatality rates are extremely low. You definitely have to have some kind of comorbidity that goes along with it. And that's not to say that deaths aren't tragic, but these deaths happen with every disease that comes along. This just happens to be another lower respiratory disease, much the same as measles, or really nasty types of influenza and pneumonia. And all of those things cause deaths. That's what a virus does, especially if you have impairments to your health. And to think that you're going to somehow find a vaccine for this when I don't even know when the last time they had to, I think measles was, but it took 10 years to develop a measles vaccine. To think that you're going to have a vaccine for this sometime in the next 6 months or a year, or that it's actually going to do you any good, is absolutely ludicrous. The people who go out and get the flu vaccine still can get the flu. They're just basing it on whatever was the latest strain that they believe that ran through China that would be then coming this way. See, it's funny how these diseases always rotate like that. Anyway, and then if they get the wrong strain, you can still get sick from it. People's faith in a system that has been telling them lies since the very beginning is just unbelievable. How do you sit there and listen to these people who have now 180'd 4, 5, 6 times? And what? Because the mainstream media is telling you? Look at these mainstream media. Oh my God. I wouldn't trust those people with my wallet. How would you trust them with your health? I have no idea how this has gotten so far. At least people are now finally waking up. People are still pushing the whole wearing of the mask issue, which is, I actually find kind of funny because of the fact that folks obviously have no idea how airflow and molecules actually work when they flow around things, nor the fact that those masks aren't really designed for viruses. They're designed for bacteria. The reason why they're worn in surgeries is so you don't get bacterial spread into wounds when they're on the table. It's also the same reason why they use multiple sets of tools for internal and external portions of the surgery to prevent infections. Viruses are an entirely different matter, of which this particular one has defied everything, seemingly, that is known about viruses throughout the world that they've had to deal with and actually studied. Anyway, masks. People wear these things, and that's fine and dandy. They're supposed to wear it so they don't breathe out or whatever, I guess, or they don't breathe in. But you'd have to suck up their air for several minutes, directly suck up their air to get the droplets that the virus travels through. If they were to sneeze in the air and you walked into it, that mask may protect you, may not, because it's not sealed. Airflow doesn't just stop because there's a barrier, but one of the major vectors happens to be the nose and the eyes. And as nasty as that is, your eyes, even if you wear goggles, I don't know how many of you actually have worked on projects, but by God, I've done paint scraping, or I've done sanding or metal grinding, and you can still get stuff in your eyes. Once again, particles go around things. And same thing if you were to walk into a sneeze, it would go through your eyes, or it would go through your nose, or it would go wherever. Point is, though, you need to have the droplets, and they have to go through a point vector to transmit the disease. But now you've got it, and you've got people sitting there telling you that you've tested positive even when you perhaps haven't taken a test. The tests themselves are extremely shady, and you have no idea. They've gone from, it takes 3 days to take a test, to, we've got a 15-minute test, which is garbage. You simply can't have a test that works like that. But everyone, has now become a modern-day epidemiologist, and they know everything that is going on with this. And it's funny, the ones who are actually still supporting the garbage of lockdowns and whatever, these are the epidemiologists that are actually either paid by A, government, or B, private grant funding, which I always find amusing, because these are the same kinds of studies where if you look deep, and there'll be studies, for example, about, the intake of sugar in huge quantities isn't necessarily bad, and then you find out the study is conducted by Coca-Cola or Pepsi, and it's like, okay, but folks don't look that deep. Once again, it's just like your officials that you're voting for in government. Nobody wants to look. Nobody wants to research. Nobody wants to see anything, because if it's bad, they just want to ignore it. They just want to walk away. But in effect, what this is doing, obviously, to our economy, you've already seen it. It was cutting demand down, and so I'll work into the demand aspect. Basically, demand, by definition, when they're looking at it, and why it's important, is because it's the ability and willingness to purchase a product at a given price. And your demand is actually what for the most part, is able to set prices, because if there's a demand for a particular product and a company comes in and they can supply it at a given price, the market will determine whether or not there is enough demand at that price to be able to purchase it. And for a handful, there may be, but then again, whatever the average cost is and the price that the company sets at for that particular product may not be enough to support the company in the long run to stay in business at all. And so there are a number of issues that go into play, but it always comes back to demand. And of course, our economy is almost entirely demand-based. Once again, the numbers are 60 to 80% of our total GDP is based on demand. Now, that's all kinds of goods and services. Your foods, coffees, any kind of thing of that sort, all of your retail, clothes, automobiles, any of your building materials, housing, and the stuff we don't export nearly as much product in terms of dollar value as we do purchase goods within this country, either from this country or mostly from other countries. And that's really the big thing. And so manufacturing is generally what you would kind of consider to be your supplier portion of that. And everybody, I think, has known and has been told over the course of these years that our manufacturing has been cut short for some time. And the demand aspect doesn't just look at that, the price aspect. So going back deeper into whether or not there is enough demand at a given price to support a company's operations, this also works for those who are in the healthcare industry, who have had time to make their TikTok videos and all of these other things, which I absolutely was just shaking my head at, because other people are sitting there forced to stay in their homes, not able to make any money, while these people are getting paid to do dance videos. But nonetheless, the basic concept is if there's no demand for a company's product, well, what does a company do? A company has to stop making so many products. It doesn't need so many workers because it's not pulling in so much money. It may even have to get to the point where it shuts down, but that's usually later on. And if it lays off workers, well, guess what it gives workers? Generally, they give them insurance of some sort. And that insurance helps with all kinds of things, whether it's hospital or medical or dental. It also covers some elective surgeries and things of that nature. And so in the end, if they don't have that money to do that, hospitals don't have their money to operate and run. And that's just a flat fact. At some point in time, you all see it. And I think a lot of people have seen it, because eventually it got to the point where they were furloughing hospitals. Now, I think that's a huge point of issue there, that if hospitals are furloughing workers, we're on the verge of having to cut costs and even lay off workers. There was definitely never the pandemic that was claimed to have been in the first place. The entire thing was shut down to dismantle the remnants of our economy and our ability to purchase things, which is our ability to, or is our demand aspect, and that there has killed supply chains for a number of industries, because, and I'll explain this in a second, but yeah, every industry is now, or has now, gotten to the point where they actually have felt it. A real quick bit, though, that they failed to mention on the testing with the COVID is the fact that it's now fairly well known, and there's a number of studies that have been done. There were studies done back in February and March. They were put out by people. The Chinese had groups of scientists that were working on papers and data, trying to figure out if there were different strains, what was working for medical treatment, all kinds of stuff. In fact, there were papers that they had put out that hydroxychloroquine was actually working way back then. There were papers that were put out where intravenous vitamin C was working. A number of things that they had put out that the mainstream media and people here wanted to poo-poo and shut down and say, well, that's crazy, or it doesn't work, or demonize the president for saying that was a possible solution. But additional papers that had come out, and not just from there, more recently, some of the Scandinavian countries, I believe, had seen it as well, that, or maybe this was the UK. However, they seem to solidify the idea that people react to it in different ways, or else there's different strains, one or the other. But you have about 80% of your population, when you get it, has mild to medium but less than severe reactions to it, meaning that you don't need hospitalization for it. About 20% have to consider hospitalization. It gets to that point where it's pretty severe, and you're considering that wow, this is something that might need a visit, might need treatment. But even of that bit, it's not 6% actually only end up being admitted to the hospital. And that's not 6% of the 20, it's 6% of the total. And then of that total, 1% end up actually needing to be looked at and considered for more advanced treatment and longer stays. And then a fraction of the 1% was actually put on ventilators. And this is suggesting that there are variations, not only reactions, but possibly a couple of different strains, and that most people will react just fine. And of course, they've also found that age and the comorbidities play into that factor. The reason why this is important is because, as I said, they don't really have the ability to come up with vaccines in 6 months' time, or whatever they had said. Measles took 10 years, I believe. And so you're not going to see it. But it's also important to recognize the fact that this isn't what they claimed it to have been. And an entire population should not have been shut down and an economy shut down. Why? Because economy also is a person's ability to survive. They provide a living, which is why it's called that, for other people, for their families. And so you then put at risk millions of people and their ability to actually eat and make a living, as opposed to just letting the disease run its course. And somewhere along the line, you suggest herd immunity, which was suggested, but then that got thrown out of the window. But who best to work herd immunity with than those who are under 40, who don't really have high risk factors that can actually take the brunt of the virus and work their way through it. Or else you do it in, groups that do that. But the whole point is that it has to be the herd immunity. But you don't really ever hear anything about that, because that wouldn't fit the narrative to destroy the entire economy and the country that goes down. And of course, if you read enough into the Marxist ploys, that works quite well to send the systemic shock that's necessary to maybe start more violence and force a reaction from government to stop that. Of course, there are plenty of videos done by doctors and medical professionals that have recognized what this is and how to go about having solutions for this. So you can look up a number of those. My biggest thing right now is the supply chain aspect and how it's actually affected supply chains and what supply chains are. And for those who don't really understand, say your grocery store, for example, the grocery store generally has a main hub distribution center that takes in different, and I know this for Target for a fact, I'm just kind of stemming out here with grocery stores, but their main distribution center might serve the northern part of a state, or, say 20, 30 stores. Just depends on how big the distribution center is and how many and how much volume each of the stores has. I'm sure you've seen Walmart distribution centers are huge. They're absolutely massive. I mean, even their stores are massive. So you get kind of the idea, but one holds products, and then from there, that's kind of that's what would be called kind of like the available customer inventory. From there, they distribute it down to their storefronts for the customers to purchase. But of course, everything that comes into that distribution center comes from other manufacturers, processors for food, if it's food related. The goods that they're selling could come from other countries, and all of these things have to be shipped either by rail or by semi-truck. But if they're coming from other countries, they have to enter into a port. That port has to go through all kinds of checks and balances and customs passage. If they came through a port, obviously backtrack, they have to come across the ocean. The ocean transportation comes on specific types of ships. And what I mean by specific ships is because of the fact that certain ships are cargo ships and they're designed to take cargo, but it's different ships for oil, or I think they use different ones for the liquid natural gas. And each ship is going to be designed specifically for a cargo that it can carry, and then there's going to be a range of cargoes that will be able to fit with that. But it's also why a lot of times people look at shipping indexes to see kind of like where it's at in terms of global economy and how trade is going. It isn't just a country's GDP that they're looking at anymore. The global trade has become such that they need to kind of consider how it's working globally, and so that becomes an index. It's an interesting thing when they talk about globalism, kind of an offshoot here. And folks bring up the fact that they look to unify certain regions and then take away sovereignty of countries, and then exploit that region through a government that is of unelected officials. And people always think, oh, that's conspiracy theory, and it's not. It's what you're taught in global economics and global trade classes at your MBA programs. And so it's not exactly a hidden secret that this occurs. It is, it's just flat taught. And that's exactly what happened in the EU. They figured you can form what's called an economic zone, and you basically erase the borders of the countries so goods can go back and forth amongst the countries, and everybody thinks this is great. But then you convince them that, oh, well, we need a common currency as well. And so you kind of create an economic monetary zone to go with this. Well, then once everybody starts using the same currency, that takes away a country's sovereignty to print their own money. And that actually becomes important. As you can see in Japan, even though they've kind of had a dead economy for years, they definitely didn't run into the same problems that Greece and Italy had run into. However, once they take control of your money, that pretty much puts the fork in you as a country for sovereign rights, and you're pretty much done, because then you have succumbed to somebody else controlling your money supply and your trade goods. And it happens to be an unelected body in Brussels that does all of this. The people that you have at your level no longer really mean anything, because if you control money supply, you pretty much control that country. But I'll mention that here in a sec. Oh, I kind of mentioned that a little bit anyway in the first episode if you want to look at foreign exchange rates. But so more on the supply chain aspect, because a lot of companies are talking about bringing supplies and supply chains back to the U.S. and manufacturing. There's difficulty with this, and it also takes large capital investment. And why you might wonder that is. First of all, oftentimes factory they need large amounts of labor or large amounts of robotic machinery, both of which take a large investment in capital to be able to either invest in robotics and use some kind of I don't know if you could even do. I mean, I'm sure you could do leasing with that rather than purchasing, but it just depends on if the actual hardware robotics would be applicable to other areas and whether they'd have value for that. People are oftentimes the cheaper version because people are much more adaptable to different situations, and that's also happens to be why when places are looking for headquarters and such, like when Amazon was doing in New York, they also have to look for the labor force available for the headquarters in that area, so they don't have to ship people from all over the country to be in that area. And it's no different with factories. You want people who are capable because training is expensive, or already specialized in whatever it is that you're doing. One good example is the carpet capital of the world in Dalton, Georgia. And it's the carpet capital because it produces more carpet there than anywhere else in the world. But once they developed that area, it's where everybody who does anything associated with carpet goes to, because they also teach it there. They teach it in their community college. They already have trained people available. And so that's one of the things you look for. It's no different than when you're doing a factory for anything else. And so you look at where we're at in our factories, and they started building them up in China. Why? Because China had huge labor potential. They were also able to save large quantities of money on training and wages, because partly the exchange rate, but also China's culture is a little bit different, where if you've seen some of the documentaries they've done, the people who work in the factories oftentimes live blocks from the factory. It's literally a city built around a factory, and that's how they work, so they don't have anywhere to go to. It's a completely different perspective. But on top of that, then these factories are built, and you need to obviously get permits for the land and construction and build them up, and not just the walls, but you actually design the factories exactly the way laid out to be most efficient for your product that you're running on the line. And they have engineers who specifically, I think it's manufacturing engineers, if I remember this title right, but it could be industrial. But one of their focuses anyway is to design and lay out factories for efficiency. For example, Volkswagen has their factory laid out where you can do all of your options and selections just like you would, say, if you've ever looked at a Tesla site, but they're able to do that right on their line. You can select all the things you want, and they'll move the car through, and you can have all the options, colors, and everything right on their line, and they'll pop it out for you and ship it to you. And so they were able to do that design. Now, this comes with years of experience, which is another thing that you need to develop as you up and move a factory or some kind of production facility. The amount that goes into just that is stuff that people overlook, and a lot of the places don't have readily available land, buildings, layouts. Not to mention, you oftentimes need special plumbing, special electrical layout, possibly additions to the grid. You might need additional roadways for the factory. Several things that people don't really consider. And this is one of the base to actually construct the products. But even from this factory, you are going to have raw material or other inputs for the product that you're going to use, and wherever they come from. So, I mean, your supply chain just keeps going. So there's finally an endpoint somewhere, but the point is that whatever country you're at and whoever's bringing these in, each of these may specialize in this unique aspect of that supply chain. And to redo your supply chains, even one little portion, can take an awful lot of time investment and development before it even becomes ready to do that portion in your chain that you need. And a lot of people overlook this, especially the infrastructure need for the factories themselves, or even the distribution lines. Like, were you to move it to a different country, perhaps, to still maybe perhaps have the same labor costs or something, you're still looking at the fact, well, does that country have an area for it to be built? Does it have roadways and rail, or does it have the port structure needed? Does it have access to the shipping lines? Does it have the basic, like I was saying, plumbing and electrical structure? But not only that, does it have the knowledge base experience and tools to actually do the construction? We take for granted the fact that we have construction companies that can do massive construction projects for highways, whether that with concrete or tar. They do bridges, massive buildings and skyscrapers. A lot of places do not have this ability. And if you need structures built, or you need mining done, or you need holes drilled, or you need whatever, you need specific equipment that may not be available in given areas. And since, if you look at Caterpillar, since they're a major provider of a lot of this equipment, and they haven't really been doing well for about the past 10 years or so, I would be willing to bet that many places do not have the equipment necessary and never really purchase the equipment necessary to do any kind of infrastructure builds. Not that they may have had a reason to, but once again, that's time to actually develop and create an area. China ran into an awful lot of this same problem when they were trying to do the One Belt, One Road initiative, when they were going overland and they were going to build a road and rail, I believe, transport system to Russia. And they had to go through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, there was probably a couple other countries. I don't know the exact route that they were choosing to go through, but they found out that these countries didn't actually do trade within their own little area, and had relatively little exchange with themselves. And so they didn't have any infrastructure already built for trade within them. And they didn't have a lot of the, once again, necessary equipment, tools, or labor knowledge to go ahead and build the infrastructure needed to build the roadways, to build railways, to have, like I was saying, plumbing, electrical, or whatever utilities needed to run a project like this. So China was putting more and more and more money into things and not getting anything out. So then they went the other route and they tried to go through the different ports through the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific. Of course, they're not necessarily always welcome everywhere, but that's besides the point. They tried to at least look at the fact that if they had the ships, and once again, like I said, there's different kinds of ships. So depending on the product you're going to use, if the ships are already taken throughout the world and they're being used for other stuff, you have to build more ships. And that was an issue that they were looking at as well. But then you need ports that can handle the ships, and ports that can handle the amount of tonnage that are coming in, and workers to work the ports. And you have to develop the ports, and then you have to develop the systems that come out of the ports, whether that's rail or road or what have you. And you need the trucking companies, the rail cars, and all of those kinds of things. There's a lot that goes into it. The fact that we have the infrastructure built up the way we do, we should be working to continually upgrade and maintain that, because the fact that we have had it done over the course of the history of our country is just a miraculous the feat and accomplishment that so many other places do not have, and we take it for granted. Going from there, since supply chain's talking manufacturing, I'll talk a little bit about the PMI. And so the PMI is the Purchasing Managers Index, and it's a survey that's done by the Institute for Supply Management. And so this is a survey that they do, and it's important to realize that it's a survey because each month it's put out and people tout it as it's this big indicator of, GDP growth and how the economy is doing and so on. And in effect, it's actually not, and I'll tell you why. Of course, they want to tout it as such, and their chief chairman, I forget what his name is, but he wants to tout it as such. But the fact is that they go about and they interview firms from like 18 different categories of manufacturing, and in order to be interviewed, you actually have to be a member of the ISM, number one, so that already kind of creates a bias. There's no real comparison for firm size or where most of their orders come from, whether it's abroad or it's domestic, who they're there's no end users, there's no real details that go into it. Basically they go in, and now granted there's also no regional, and they do point that out. That's just overall through the US, and I think it's because of the fact you have to be a member of it, so they're just hoping anybody will be a member to join. But you basically, in essence, you get asked, hey, are you doing better, are you doing the same, are you doing worse? And then they look at the percentages of who said each thing, and then they give a weight to them, and that's a diffusion index. And so if you said you're doing better, you get a 1. If you said you're doing the same, it's a 0.5. If you said you're doing worse, it's a 0. And it leaves your 50%, which, if you see a number like 50.1 or 48 or what have you, that's where it comes from. Those are those percentages of good, average to bad. And so anything above 50 is supposed to be expansion growth or a good indication for the GDP or the economy. But it doesn't really end up providing that. In fact, the crazy thing is that most people felt the economy was doing fairly well before we went into this. And there were 5 straight months of 48s, which would suggest that things were in a contraction phase for the last 6 months of 2000. The one study that was used did suggest that it did have marginal predictive power to predict business cycle lengths, and was able to help shape some policy decisions for firms and even government for that matter. And so there was some ability to use that, and I can definitely see that, because if you don't use the number itself and as a whole on the index, and you actually break it down to its parts, then it becomes much more effective. And there was another economist, his name was Roland Pelez, and his 2002 study, he looked at how well it was at predicting GDP, but found that there's actually 3 sub-indexes that worked better predictability-wise, and they were the new orders, the employment, and the supplier deliveries portions of the index and index survey, and they worked much better. And that just kind of goes back to, if you do econometrics, they just simply included too many variables that weren't necessary, and they can cause bias in your numbers if you have too many, if I remember all that right. But there are a number of assumptions. If you do, the reason why I mentioned that, there's a number of assumptions that are done, and you have to check for all these different things when you're actually doing. When you're actually using your data for your independent variables and looking for a dependent variable outcome. And so that was just one thing in those assumptions. You can have too many variables, you can have too few variables, you may have to replace one if there's too much co-integration between variables, and then too many influences. So those, when they do these, they are fairly robust, and so there is some comfort in the validity of the findings that these guys actually did have. Now, to go beyond that, this is it is more considered, and I would suggest, rather than using, like I said, the whole overall index number, the sub index areas as kind of an indicator, and because it is more of an immediate kind of flag as to how things are going, if you can kind of figure out what you're looking for. If you want more of a lagged indicator slightly, there are other ones that are more accurate. You can use the Federal Reserve Industrial Production Index, the Census Bureau's Manufacturing Shipments and Inventories and Orders Index, and then there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well. And of course, they all cover exactly what I was saying, basically new orders, employment, and supplier deliveries anyway. And so that's your big deal. But why did those 3 predict it? If you're looking at supplier deliveries, what that means is specifically suppliers are bringing in the inputs in order to make the products. New orders obviously are the orders from your down the line sources, your users, whoever are going to use the components next. And so you're making the product for them to sell to them, and they're paying you for it. And then of course employment, because employment always suggests that if there's a demand for your product and demand is increasing, then you have to supply more, which oftentimes, you increase labor because you need more people to work more hours to do that, especially if you have a facility that isn't running at full capacity. Otherwise, in order to produce more, you may have to look at some kind of investment, your fixed assets to produce more and expand capacity. But if you're not running at that, and you're not running 24/7, you're not running 3 different shift periods, then you can always increase labor, increase time, and put out more output that way as well. And so that makes sense. The bad thing is that so they were touting this as a positive news. However, the ones that were most indicative of GDP were also some of the worst numbers. Your employment was down at 42, and that was up from where it was at 38. However, if you actually go in and you look at the manufacturing payrolls, you can see the drop off of the payrolls 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and the very, very slight rebound in terms of actual numbers in employment. And so it's very, very slow to rebound, and that's the very last thing that's probably going to come back. It's going to take quite a bit more orders before the manufacturers feel comfortable to bring labor back full on where it was at. That's always the last thing to drag beyond. Supplier deliveries, they touted as good at 56.9, but if you actually looked back month over month for the past several months, supplier deliveries actually generally sits up around 68 to 70, not at 56.9. And so that was not necessarily as good as they wanted to tout either. Another big thing, not that this hasn't happened before, but was customer inventories. Remember, like I said, that's where they feel comfortable with the amount of inventory to send to direct front end shops or stores for customers to purchase. They were all too low, and that's not the first time it's happened. That has happened before. But in this instance, it means it's too low because of the fact that there's nothing in the supply chains being produced to put on the shelves, and they don't really know how much they're going to replace. And that's not necessarily a good indicator as either. All of these things kind of bode poorly, especially in the event that they went through brand new shutdown periods for everything, which is, of course, going to restrict demand again. Without demand, none of this stuff runs and starts up. Of course, without money, none of this stuff does either. It goes back to now them doing exactly kind of what I said in episode 1, as these companies are looking at things, and it doesn't really matter what business you're in, you kind of have to look at this. You have to go back and now look and make predictions on where you think demand for your product is going to be at, and determine what you want to do given that demand. And it's kind of the interesting thing because they teach you for micro, that in a competitive market or a monopoly, you've got different aspects for that. If you're in a competitive market, you're generally a price taker. Monopoly, you can kind of set your prices. But in the competitive market, which most people are, you're going to take whatever price and you're going to choose what quantity you're going to provide, and that's where they're at. Most of these companies are in a fairly competitive, not necessarily perfectly competitive market, and the prices are already fairly well set for now. We haven't really seen tons of deflation, inflation. It kind of has happened in different areas, and so that obviously plays into the whole mix. I really think this is why economics becomes really interesting, because of the strategy and the play that goes involved. It's like playing chess and being 7 moves ahead and seeing how all the things interact. Just different things to consider. And of course, the more data that it's available to you, the more it kind of helps to see what's going to happen, and the more relationships in the data that can be found. And then, of course, you can also measure those relationships, and you can actually check for correlations and causality. One important note is that correlation does not mean causality. It does not imply causality. Those are two different things. Going back to, so the companies are doing kind of what I mentioned. They're going to trim down everything, check out their demand, look at where the prices are at, determine what they can supply at that, and then they have to determine whether they're going to stay or exit the market, and where that's going to sit at for them. And of course, that's comes into how price compares to their average cost. If price is over average cost, you've got your firms are going to start entering, but if price is under the average cost, then they exit. And of course, if you're having lower demand and you've got your base fixed costs anyway, if you're not really producing enough and your average cost is rising because of that, you're not getting any benefits of scale. You're going to see more firms exiting and barely holding on. And most of these firms, of course, operate on or with substantial amounts of debt. A lot of people always say, "Well, why is that? Why is that?" The reason is because debt has benefits. It's got that tax shield aspect to it, and oftentimes it's cheaper than equity. I know I mentioned equity briefly in the first episode, but debt ends up being cheaper than equity for the most part for a company in terms of like what people are looking for return. And oftentimes people will utilize debt right up to that maximum portion. Of course, how much debt, it varies, because with enough debt, people get a little bit uneasy with it, and companies can go into kind of a distressed state if they make people feel uneasy, and that'll change everything. But up to a certain point, debt for a company works out, and it works on their return on investment capital and whether they can grow or not. Then there's more into it than that when you're looking at different ways to create market value or economic value or whatever. But anyway, these companies are really going to be struggling with the fact of whether they even want to stay open or not. And that in and of itself is based entirely upon whether or not the other sectors of the economy can come back and create some sort of demand. Of course, I don't really believe that you can create an artificial demand. You get into a situation like this, and it's very much like the Great Depression, where people are going to stockpile any money they have, and they're going to do the same thing companies do. They bare minimum spend, and they try to just get by because they don't know what happens around the corner, especially with, oh, there's future lockdowns. We may lock down this. Oh, there's another way. We're going to lock down again. If they keep doing that, people can't be assured of the fact that they're going to be able to get more government stimulus checks or whatever was keeping them on, which granted is not how it's supposed to be done in the first place, but they're not sure if this is going to happen. Now, mind you, all of this is mostly exacerbated by the fact that, once again, remember, like I said, government took away your ability to be self-sufficient. They restrict what you can do. They restrict what you can do with your property and your housing and everything else. They force you into areas in which you are completely dependent upon the structures of that society. And this is not good. And it's really not good now, and you should be able to see that. And so now, branching into government and the reaction to this and what's happening, the Fed had come in and they gave bailout money and $1 trillion, and everybody cheers and yay, that's great. Only it's not, because it didn't really act as stimulus. Wasn't able to stimulate anything. Like I said, you can't create artificial stimulus. The people who received the money ended up just depositing it for the most part, because you can look at bank deposits over the time period of the last 6-7 months, and you can see them trend increasingly upward. It's nice sloped up, and you could probably relate to the fact that nobody really knows what to do with the money anyway. You don't invest in businesses if you don't think there's going to be any demand or anybody to buy your products. And you don't really invest in markets that you don't know whether the bottom is going to drop out again or what's happening. The fact that this market is going up is because it's fully and completely artificially stimulated. All the Fed's money is going into it, and that's what you're seeing in the rise of the equity. Because in all truth, if you were to kind of evaluate this, the companies that can't make their payment are all on the verge of financial distress anyway, which makes your equity worthless. Just throwing that point out there. I mean, it's a big broad statement, but you really have to kind of start to consider and watch that as this is occurring. Also, the fact that everything is so tied in globally, you have to pay attention to global markets on top of that, and what are other economies and other governments doing to their people, because we depend on them for goods and services, the imports that we bring in, just like we depend on them to purchase some of ours on our exports. Once again, the big one we rely on is usually some kind of financial securities. It's where we kind of we don't really balance stuff out, but I mean, that's the only thing that really saves us. It's our capital account, and as opposed to just like the goods and services includes this securities that people buy. And like I explained, it's kind of like us having a credit card saying, hey, will you, borrow us this money, we'll pay you some stuff back, and we'll run a deficit. Another really scary thing was the fact that you can see, if you look at foreign investment in securities, that it has steadily dropped off, and we have had a couple of really big drop-offs the last couple of months. And I already kind of went over what happens with that, or the potential for that, when dollars become basically worthless. But that's another concept that shouldn't really need to be explained outright. In economics, the big thing is that it's all about value, how you value things, and price, utility, all kinds of different functions go in that. But value implies scarcity. Now, that doesn't mean all scarce items have value. There's got to be something to it. But if something's valuable, it means there's not a lot of it, or it's not readily available. Because if it was, you wouldn't have to worry about it. If it's free, you don't even worry about that kind of stuff. There's no competition for it, and nobody really worries about it. If nobody desires it, then it has no value anyway, and so it's the same kind of boat. So if something has value, it's scarce. That's the implication. Now, with the quantitative easing that I was just talking about, and the bailout packages that were being spent, that money is obviously no longer. And I mean, I guess you could say it's backed by the faith of the working taxpayer, and that's how they always got away with printing so much. But if you've got a free and open printing press and it no longer seems like there's any attachment to that, well, then the money itself is no longer scarce either, and therefore has no value. And it's more of a, I don't know, philosophical look at that perspective. There's not really any science data necessarily backing that, because all the currencies are fiat, but it's just kind of a way to look at why that is playing into an effect. But a bigger issue on top of that is the fact that when I was talking about government structures and communism, communist government's state-owned. Well, what is the Fed doing? The Fed is literally buying everything that is on the market. Now they started with just, they were only really allowed to do treasuries. And this has never been in their whole charter. You can read the Fed charter, and it was changed, I think, in 70 from the original 1913 charter, but they weren't supposed to be able to be manipulating this stuff. They can't create economy. Keynesian economists always think that debt spending is the way to go. Well, debt spending through government is stealing money from the taxpayers. That's what it is. And the interesting thing I always find is that Keynesians kind of branched off of Ricardo's theories, but guess who else branched off of Ricardo's theories? It was Karl Marx. And that's that half. That's the opposite half from the Austrians. And of course, they always say there's no real Austrian economists, but there's definitely more free market than what those guys were doing. But government spending only begets more government spending, more government programs, more government employees, and takes more and more money from the taxpayers and the people till where they have less and less. And now we're in this situation where the only entity that has money is the government, and it doesn't have any money, mind you. It either steals from us or prints it for free, and it's using that money that either has no value or is from our tax dollars that we're not going to be able to pay back anyway, and is using that to buy all of these companies that were supposedly, free market companies that some people have equity in, but they're not really going to be able to have any money because they're on the verge of going bankrupt, because all the debts are going to be owed to the Fed Reserve, who's purchasing. Well, I guess the Treasury's allowing them to. I don't know how that whole thing is working out right now. They're kind of one and the same, which also is not how it's supposed to be. They're supposed to be separate entities. Your Fed was not supposed to be beholden to a government. It was supposed to be politically separate. But it's a scary thought to think that they've now jumped from just running the quantitative easing, the purchasing of the securities, the treasury bills from the U.S., to now jumping into purchasing bonds from corporations. How long before they jump in and say, oh, well, you just outright purchase shares? Well, then they own firms. Then they own actual productive property, which is communism. is running this down the line. I think hopefully if I went from the beginning of this to the end of this, that drew some kind of a path and how a lot of this stuff is interrelated, and maybe drew out some kind of ideas. But it's not a great perspective if you're sitting in there dealing with that. So anyway, I ran long on this one. I'm sorry, but I hope maybe you got something out of it.